In 2312, an older man took the stage during a graduation ceremony for a new class of freshly minted space explorers, humans who were part of the first generation to feel the light of another star. Many would be the first humans to explore worlds beyond the solar system and find strange and bizarre anomalies which had only been theories for hundreds of years. The man on stage was instantly recognizable, as he was arguably the most famous human who had ever lived. He was known as the First Jumper, but most knew him as Nick Croshaw, the father of the jump drive. After the applause died down, he began his speech, one that has echoed down the ages of time and still reverberates today.
My friends, we have entered a new phase of human existence. While before we could only dream of expanding into the stars or walking across the savannas of distant worlds, we no longer need to imagine this future. We have become explorers again. We have resurrected mystery, discovery, and adventure. We have fueled the fires of our industry and imagination. Looking over the face in this great hall, I see nothing but kindred spirits. Every one of you has the same fire, the same eagerness that I had to strike out into the unknown and make it known. But understand that it won't be easy. Without struggle, there is no advancement. Without setback, there is no determination. Without obstacles, there is no real triumph. These challenges will embolden us, make us dig our feet into the dirt, hold our ground, and choose to fight for the future that we want to live in. So that is the question. A simple one that falls to you to answer. Where do we go from here? It's up to you, citizens of the stars.
This speech is still quoted to this day by anyone who wants to illustrate what it means to explore the stars and encapsulates the early days of extrasolar exploration, when explorers and colonists traveled to distant stars, often with little more than a good ship and a dream. After Croshaw returned from his historic jump in 2271, humanity was like the proverbial dog that caught the car, entirely unprepared to tackle this new challenge. Unlike the dark days of the overpopulation era, where desperation drove the people of Earth to expand or die, this new discovery was literally uncharted territory. No one could agree on how to proceed with the colonization of this new system, or even if they should expand beyond our sun. The only thing everyone seemed to agree on was its name, the Croshaw system. This new system was slightly smaller than our solar system, with 4 planets. The first is a Venusian smog-type planet filled with orange and yellow clouds. These clouds make Croshaw 1 a beautiful sight, but also constitute a major danger, as they are both corrosive and toxic, instantly removing the planet from the running of being terraformed. The second planet was a better candidate. Croshaw 2 was very similar to Earth in its atmospheric composition and geologic structure, with large bodies of liquid water and vast expanses of land dotted with many mountains. Croshaw 3 was much less ideal. At the furthest edge of the habitable green band of the system's star, its temperatures were far colder than Croshaw 2. However, it possessed the same potential for terraformation. The last planet in the system was the first super-Earth humanity had ever laid eyes on. Almost twice the size of our homeworld, Croshaw 4 lay far outside the habitable zone, and once held an atmosphere, that had been stripped away from the planet long before humanity stepped foot on its surface. The first attempts to tame the system were ad hoc and haphazard. Several private and state-owned terraforming companies tried to terraform Croshaw 2 and 3, but all failed due to lack of funds, resources, and the extreme difficulty of getting supplies from Sol to support their efforts. As Croshaw was well outside the range of even the fastest means of communication, the only way to get messages to Sol was by courier. A pilot had to fly back through the jump point to broadcast messages, an often deadly task. Though Croshaw had developed the engine, it was far from refined. Many of the first travelers to the jump point disappeared on their journey to and from Croshaw due to their jump drives being little more than ad hoc modified quantum drives, like Nick Croshaw's was. Many would not successfully make it through the jump, making attempts at settling the new system even harder. Luckily, the labs at Robert Space Industries took Croshaw's research and found a way to mass produce the results. Even though the end result was expensive and in limited supply, RSI's QM-Core 12 jump drive slowly allowed the governments of Earth and a select few adventurous pioneers to head out into the new system and the farthest reaches of known space to find more systems for humanity to call home. Ironically, as the process became safer, the cost was egregiously expensive, and the company that had made space travel attainable by the average person was now pricing all but the most elite universities, corporations, and governments out of exploring the stars. Despite these advancements in safety, pilots still had to physically navigate the jump tunnels themselves. This task was often fraught with dangers, and because humanity had entirely distrusted AI at this point, it was left to a core of human pilots who managed to both survive the jumps and keep their passion for the dangerous job alive in order to keep the lines of supplies and communication back and forth open. These pilots became known as jumpers. They were a tight-knit community of amateur explorers who were educated in the sciences, paid close attention to the news, studied any and all star charts they could get a hold of, and consistently debated the merits of the best ship to travel interspace in. Still, only a lucky few would be able to experience the travel due to the rarity of jump drives. Those that did learned how to navigate the eddies of the jump points and sold their services to the highest bidder, thus raising the cost of jump travel even further. Rather than pull together as humanity did with Project Renatus, companies and nations squabbled over how land rights and mineral resources should be divided up once the terraformation process was complete. One woman watched this process devolve with disgust. The president from the Martian Institute of Space and Technology, Adrienne Zemlach. Zemlach had been a politician years before and found the handling of the entire situation deplorable. Nations and companies fighting over resources and land rights before they could even be extracted. Her experience would color her own view of the process of space exploration, one that would prove vital in the years to come. It wasn't long before the nations of Earth and Mars would call a world summit to deal with the issue. By 2281, the various organizations came to an agreement to jointly fund and collaborate on a project to terraform and colonize the Croshaw system. They established the Croshaw Expansion Committee to head this project, and various nations in attendance would sign a treaty known as the Freeman Act. The Freeman Act would guarantee members of the World Summit nations the free right to settle the Croshaw system and sell one-way tickets to the system, which would go to fund the terraformation of the planets. At first, this was seen as truly dangerous, and few signed up, but the committee would fund marketing campaigns to improve the image of extrasolar colonization, and this eased the worries of the public. By the late 2880s, Croshaw 2 and 3 were well on their way to becoming the second and third planets terraformed by humanity. Around this time, a new communication service became available for the first time. It was called Spectrum. This was a unified platform combining the features of the internets of Earth and Mars to connect the entire system with the new colonists of the Croshaw system. It very likely was developed as part of the process of colonizing Croshaw to improve communication between the two star systems. While it seems to have been initially meant mostly for communication, it would soon encompass art, music, news, and entertainment channels for all with access to enjoy. It was in the midst of this slow process in 2287 when two PhD students from the Martian Institute of Space and Technology, Leona Sono and Neil Numento, would make another amazing discovery in the Croshaw system. Sono was an engineering student and accomplished pilot who wanted to test the accuracy of her ship's atomic navigational clock while traversing the Sol Croshaw jump point. Numento was an astrophysicist and friend of Sono, who accompanied her to collect data on Croshaw's plasma. The trip was going according to plan, and the duo began to turn their ship around and prepare to return to Sol. It was then that Numento's drones returned a strange string of data. This intrigued the two students, who followed this strange signal to discover what they found was another jump point. Powering up their ship's jump drive, they leaped into the opening of this newly discovered tunnel and into the light of yet another star. According to their own account, when they exited the jump point, Sono turned to Numento and asked what had just happened, to which Neil smiled and replied with one word: history. The two would then return to their university with their discovery logged. They immediately confided in the president of MIST, one Adrienne Zemlock. Her disgust with how Croshaw was handled would lead her to formulate a plan, one she hoped would cut out the corporations which she felt had far too much say in the goings-on of the various nations of the World Summit. Zemlock approached the World Summit to announce the discovery of the second jump point in Croshaw, but refused to hand over the location data without assurances. Zemlock used her experience as a politician to wheel and deal with the summit, saying that she would hand over the data only if legal guarantees were made to ensure a quarter of the land on all habitable and terraformable planets in the system would be preserved for educational purposes. The pushback from companies like Argo and RSI was tremendous, seeing the potential profits to be reaped from brand new systems taken away for nebulous educational purposes was outlandish to the corporate giants of the time. However, other institutions rallied around Zemlock. She was likely one of the first to utilize Spectrum to spread her message of responsible expansion. This pressure would eventually cause the World Summit to relent and agree to her terms. The system would be named Redder, the nickname of Adrienne Zemlock, in her honor and as a reminder that, quote, words have the power to shape worlds. Surveys would be sent out and find a system almost 2 times the size of our solar system, with 5 terrestrial planets, 3 of which resided inside the green band and were candidates for terraformation. The first planet was found to be a small, rocky dwarf planet with no prospects for terraformation and an inhospitable climate. However, the second planet was quickly discovered to have vast quantities of rare elements like neodymium, iridium, and samarium. It was because of this lucrative discovery that Redder would get a boost in its colonization over Croshaw. The World Summit would auction off the rights of the planet and use the funds to terraform Redder 3 and 4. Several universities were immediately founded in the system, seemingly before the terraformation had been completed. These universities were located on Redder 3, known as Reese, and Redder 4, known as Mentor. Redder 2 would gain the name Percy, and as the planet was mined for its riches, many think tanks and technological labs were created on the planet in the quarter designed for educational use. These institutions would lead to the development of the first flight-assisted nav drives that would record flight paths through charted jump points. These technological developments would make travel safer and cheaper through jump points, and boosted the confidence in settlement in systems like Redder and Croshaw. However, it was only the beginning of the floodgates of exploration. In 2290, a man named Antoine Lebec became the first jumper to go from hobbyist to professional explorer, becoming the first of what would be known as nav jumpers, when he discovered a brand new system all on his own. Unfortunately for him, the system would turn out to be the toughest challenge for humanity yet. It is claimed, though disputed, that when he discovered this system, he was asked if he found anything interesting there. He would reply, Null, in the negative, which would eventually become the name of the system. Despite the veracity of the claim, the system does live up to its name. It's over 23 times larger than Sol, being the largest system humanity had ever discovered at that point. The star is a yellow supergiant that often swells to 10 to 15 times its standard size. It is because of its size that the system is renowned to be very easy to traverse, with its 5 planets spread out in the system. However, it's the star's pulsing that makes the system difficult to settle. The inner planets are being ravaged by their star, while the outer planets are so far away from their star that their seasons are terrible to grow crops, and even traverse to, making even importing food difficult. The first planet in the system is a dwarf planet that is slowly being burnt away from the sporadic growth of its parent star. The second planet is made of mostly iron, but sits too close to the star to be safely mined. However, the third planet sits on the edge of the green band. Its atmosphere is composed of ammonia and sulfur, though the pressures and geologic composition are similar to Earth, meaning that humans can walk the surface without a pressure suit, though the dangerous atmosphere and intense heat from the sun mean it's only able to be traversed in environmental suits with respirators. As a result, it has earned the nickname Coal. Null 4 is a gas giant that suffers from a permanent electric storm that makes any attempt to tap hydrogen or other gases from it impossible. The only highlight of the system is the fifth planet, known as Ashana. It's a desert world, but much more hospitable than Coal. However, because of its extreme orbit, even this planet is difficult at best to live on. So while humanity would endeavor to brave the worlds of Null like they did with Croshaw and Rudder before them, the system would prove far too volatile with far too little value. Null would become the first dead-end system of humanity, a sobering lesson that not all systems are worth the effort to settle. Around the discovery of Null, 2 jumpers met in a small refueling station near the Sol Croshaw jump point. Terra Delone and Alphonsus Cabrino were working as mechanics on the station with dreams of exploring the stars. However, the cost of jump travel had held these dreams back from becoming a reality. Since they couldn't travel on jump ships, they both figured they'd at least work on them. Thus, the two found themselves kindred spirits in a lonely way station on the way out of the system. Then, one day, in August of 2290, a large transport ship pulled into the station. Its jump drive had failed, and the owner had far too much on the line with the trip to risk taking it to an authorized RSI mechanic. With a duo the only mechanics on the station, they got straight to work on the drive. Well, every jumper had their own well-read and notated copy of the maintenance manual for the RSI jump drive. This was the first time the pair had actual hands-on experience, and they were eager to see what the machine actually looked like from the inside. In the process of repairing the drive, Terra and Alphonsus were puzzled. The jumper community had always believed that the techs at RSI had managed to develop some new cutting-edge tech with a jump drive. But once they cracked it open, they realized it was just a NIC. NICs were what jumpers called modified quantum drives, named in honor of Nick Croshaw, who had effectively simply modified a quantum core engine to manipulate the jump tunnel. Since the first successful jump, people had been making NICs for years with unreliable and dangerous results. The RSI jump drive had put this practice out of fashion and had made the process much more reliable and safe. However, all that the researchers at RSI had done was perfect the NIC. The two realized this was their chance to really find out what made the jump drive so different from other NICs, so they stalled the owner as long as they could. They had discovered that the issue was a faulty wire almost instantly, so they had unfettered access to the drive for a day to really puzzle what RSI did. After taking copious notes, the two sent the stressed owner off on his journey and began their own project. They were going to build an affordable jump drive. Because all RSI did was build a modified quantum drive, they figured that they could simplify the process by attaching an exterior jump drive as an aftermarket kit to a stock quantum core engine. This would mean that any quantum-capable ship would effectively be able to travel any jump point with just slight modifications instead of an expensive new drive. After 27 months, nearly all their money, and as much hands-on experience they could get with any jump drive they could find, they had done it. The add-on took up most of the cargo hold on their ship, but it was far less expensive than the RSI alternative. All that was left was to test it. The two settled their worldly affairs, not knowing if they would come back from their experimental test, and named their drive after themselves, remarking it was the closest thing they would have to a child. They called it Tarsus, and a portmanteau of their first names. On November 7th, 2292, they pushed away from the station towards the jump point. Luckily, they managed to travel to Croshaw and back safely, and in the same safety margin as the RSI drives. It was a success, and word spread amongst the jumper community, who began to ask for Tarsus drives of their own. It was here that fate dealt them a good hand, because as they were building new modules for their friends, Selma Tontil, a fellow jumper and lawyer by trade, advised they patent their invention before sending any new models out, knowing that once news spread beyond their small community, everyone would reverse engineer Tarsus drives. They agreed, and the trio formed the Tarsus Corporation. Just as they did, word leaked of their success, and demand for drives skyrocketed. While Tarsus drives were big, they were a fraction of the cost of the RSI jump drive, and worked with all existing engines. RSI moved fast to try and stem the bleeding, suing the company. However, Tontil skillfully outmaneuvered the larger corporation and set the precedent that everyone had the right to modify their own drives. 6 months after the defeat, RSI began to offer their own version of the Tarsus drive, possibly proving that they had deliberately increased the cost of travel for their own ends. The first in a long line of unscrupulous business decisions by the pioneers of space travel, an attempt to, as their founder stated, always stay relevant. As humanity started to get up to speed exploring the universe, a change had started at home. With every new system came arguments and debates on what to do, as there was resources, money, and lives on the line, with a lot to lose. As a result, it's likely at this time that settlers of these distant suns began adding weapons to their personal possessions alongside those brought by the colony itself. It was a lawless frontier, and in that kind of environment, the right weapon might be the difference between life and death. It was this reason that a small weapons manufacturer, founded on Earth in 2280 named Garrity Arms, would move to Mars and manufacture the first human-designed off-world weapon, the Tej-8 handgun. It wasn't to be the last either, as Garrity Arms weapons became staples of every human looking to test their luck on new worlds. Not all was violence, however. The day-to-day lives of these settlers was often boring. While waiting for schools to be constructed, the children of these new colonies found themselves bored. In one unknown colony, a group of children had discovered that the static advanced termination arresters, the bug stopper force fields on the doors of the prefab colony buildings, could be modified. These children would take to tweaking the force fields to knock cups and books out of people's hands as they passed through them to prank people and alleviate their boredom. One day, a ball was accidentally kicked towards a door with the modified SATA field, causing the ball to bounce back to the child. It was then that these children came up with a plan. The adults of the colony soon found that some SATA fields had been removed from the few doorways, and soon they found them being used by the children for a brand new game in an empty lot. Not wanting to discourage the youths, the colony ordered the cheapest SATA fields they could buy to allow the children to play their new game. However, it wasn't long before adults began to play as well, realizing how fun it was and started to form their own teams for more organized play. The sport would spread from colony to colony, being experimented and modified depending on who played it. However, it would eventually become known as Sataball. Humanity kept expanding with the discovery of the Fora system, discovered from the Redder system. This new system was 3 times the size of Sol with 5 planets, but sadly it was mostly empty. The star itself is a main sequence dwarf K, with its first 2 planets being a dead dwarf planet and a coreless world with some resources to exploit. The only true interesting planet is Fora 3, known as Hyperion. This world is hot and dry with little in the way of resources, but it was at the right distance from its star and made of the right materials to make it a candidate for terraformation. Fora 4 is a hydrogen-helium gas giant, and its outermost planet is an ice giant with a water and ammonia atmosphere. While the system had more promise than Null, it was obvious that the process of breathing life into Fora 3 would be a daunting one. However, Tradmore Terraforming Concern felt it was worth a shot and purchased the rights to the world. By 2317, the system was crawling with contractors of every kind, starting the long and precise work of terraforming. To pass the time, Aldis Danyan, likely a jumper, formed an exploration club with the other contractors called the Imrim Association. Since the widespread adoption of the Tarsus drives, a new wave of jumpers began combing every system for signs of new jump points. As a result, there was an explosion of new organizations similar to the Imrim Group, filled with new hope for new discoveries, as the means to explore the galaxy was becoming cheaper and more common. It was at this time that the loose association of space enthusiasts became amateur explorers for real, with jumpers evolving into what would become known as nav jumpers, due to many finally being able to chart the distant stars they had dreamed of. This had also been a large factor in the development of the forest system itself, allowing for easier and less expensive transportation to work on the terraformation project, including many members of the IA. One day, Danyan picked up a strange pocket of radiation in the middle of space. She sent out a comm to her fellow IA members to investigate the anomaly, but by the time they arrived, Danyan was gone. Assuming that she had found a new jump point, the IA tried to search for the same signatures, but found nothing. When she didn't re-emerge after some time, the group became concerned and contacted the World Summit for help. Eventually, a military Pathfinder group was dispatched to her last coordinates to search. When they finally discovered the jump point, they found the source of the strange radiation. On the other side was a deadly pulsar. Aldis Danyan was never found, but she was credited with the system's discovery, and the IA was allowed to name it. In honor of their lost leader, they named the new system after the nickname she had when she played Sataball in college, Banshee. Because of the volatile nature of this new system, travel to it was restricted and highly discouraged. It is possible that there wasn't even an official survey done of the system until much later. The spinning pulsar was far too dangerous for most ships of the time, and it was easier to dissuade travelers than it was to try to make the system safer. In 2337, back on Mars, a man by the name of Otis Boussard founded a small industrial mining company. Otis named his company after the nickname he had growing up, Grey Cat, which he had earned when his hair turned gray when he was in his early 20s. He was hoping to take advantage of the often literal gold rush to new systems, and began designing tools and equipment for mining in all kinds of environments. It didn't take long before his company was well regarded amongst miners, and they were making a tidy profit. However, his company struggled to grow as the pace of human exploration ramped up. By the early 24th century, Null had become a popular place for nav jumpers to test their luck, likely due to its sheer size. This is the same reason why raiders had become more common in the Null system as well. It was easier to pilfer from these struggling colonists than try and make a living legitimately. With the size of the system and how far away it was from Sol, the militaries of Earth found it difficult to patrol and keep the peace there. This would lead to the events of 2341, when Ashley Gone, a hauler working in Null, was swarmed by pirates. In desperation, she quantum traveled away in a blind jump, only to stumble upon a strange anomaly, which she realized was a jump point. Gone quickly turned the data to the government for the reward, named it after her father, Caliban, and vanished from the public eye. Soon after, Pathfinders were dispatched to chart the jump point, only to discover a large system, twice the size of Sol with 5 planets. Caliban 1 was a coreless rock which, at the time, had bountiful resources. The second planet would earn the nickname Creon and was a great candidate for terraformation. The third planet was a desert world and less attractive than Creon. The last 2 planets are a gray-green gas giant made of silicate and iron and a protoplanet lacking an atmosphere. However, when the Pathfinders were surveying Creon, they discovered that they weren't the first humans in the system, creating a doubt as to the veracity of Ashley Gone's story. This criminal activity did not dissuade other nav jumpers from testing their luck, which was proven fortuitous, as in 2356, 2 systems were discovered from Null, Vega and Oberon. Vega was seen as a system with a bright future. Of its 4 planets, 2 were excellent candidates for terraformation. Oberon, on the other hand, was an entirely different story. The Lindy was an exploration ship searching the outer limits of Null for new jump points since 2348. By 2356, it was running low on funds and resources when it finally detected a new jump point. The crew successfully traveled the jump point and emerged into the system with an incredibly dense neutron star at its core, about twice the mass of most G-type main sequence stars, despite having a solar radius that is the fraction of its size. The system was originally a binary star system, but when one of the stars went supernova 1.4 billion years ago, its companion star was gravitationally collapsed and its outer layers stripped away, leaving a planetoid and 6 other planets, which formed out of the chaos and debris of the event. To the crew of the Lindy, this was the payday they were looking for, but unfortunately, they would never reap the rewards. The Lindy was found drifting in the Null system several days later, likely due to a failure of its overstretched nav computer during its return jump. The crew were dead, and the salvage ship that discovered the wreck took the nav data, and its owner, Stacia Roltz, would sell it to the highest bidder for a substantial sum of money. By now, the frenzied chaos of exploration by hundreds of nations and thousands of companies, none of which had any guiding oversight, was attracting speculators who were desperate to be on the ground floor of another Redder or Croshaw. So the rights to the system were sold to a company called Tatiana Terraforming, who named it Oberon. Unfortunately for Tatiana Terraforming, they spent most of their money on the system and had little left to attempt to terraform the only real viable candidate, Oberon 2. So they came up with an ingenious solution. They sold parts of the future world to those who would help terraform it, in lieu of pay. They even used the name to try to entice people to come to work for them, claiming the world of your dreams is yours for the making. It was very successful. Hyped up on the initial successes of extrasolar colonization, thousands of people signed on, mostly from Sol, and many sold everything they owned to put it all on the line for the future of this new world. The plan might have even worked if it weren't for the nature of Uriel. It was far from an ideal candidate. It was far too cold. But Tatiana Terraforming had a bold solution: heat up the core. The only issue was this had never been done before. Nevertheless, Tatiana Terraforming was going to try. A few years later, in 2362, in the Forest system, a security contractor for Tradmore terraforming concern named Dahe Oka had lost contact while on patrol. As a search party mobilized to try and find the missing pilot, he suddenly re-emerged and promptly quit without explanation or even logging his last day's flight. Normally, this would raise some eyebrows, but at the time, Tradmore was distracted with the utterly botched attempt at terraforming Hyperion. By 2364, Tradmore had entirely failed in terraforming the planet. It had a breathable atmosphere, but most of the planet was covered in dust and clay, which would whip up into gigantic storms and drop fine silicate on everything it passed over. Agriculture was impossible, and life on Hyperion was bleak at best. So, when Oka returned as the head of his own company, with an offer to buy their terraformation platforms, they were too desperate to say no, with bills and lawsuits they had to settle. They even sold it at a discount, as they believed Nemo Co. would have to disassemble the platforms to make them fit in the Redder Fora jump point. But just after the deal, Nemo Co. announced their formal discovery of a new jump point in the Fora system, a massive one, which they named Nemo. This all seemed too good to be true, so Tradmore did some digging in Oka's file to find his last day working for them. It was then they realized that he had found the jump point as a contractor working for Tradmore, so the rights of the spoils of this new system were rightfully theirs. Oka had gone to great lengths to cover up this fact, even selling the ship that had made the discovery in order to prevent any data from that first jump to be held against him. The legal case that followed would bury Tradmore, and was likely influential on the people of Sol. They were watching as this wild west of space exploration was becoming more confusing and uglier with each passing year. many with concerns over if this pace was sustainable, or that this would lead to eventually more conflicts on the still healing Earth over colonial aspirations. The Nemo system itself has only 3 planets: a small protoplanet near its star, a pot-marked mesoplanet after that, and the crown jewel of the system, Nemo 3, also known as Ergo. Ergo is an ocean world located in the sweet spot inside its green band, making the terraformation process much easier. To cap it off, Nemo discovered a rare resource, one that had driven the people of Earth to the brink of extinction years ago: petroleum. What made this discovery even more odd was that there was no indication of any life on the planet. Natural petroleum was the only indicator that life had once existed on the planet, and even then, it's not entirely proven yet. A year later, a dedicated surveying ship working the vast reaches of Null discovered yet another jump point, this one leading to another massive system, 4 times the size of Sol. There were 5 planets, 4 terrestrial and 1 super Jupiter. The first and 4th planets were of no interest. The second was just inside the green band, meaning it could support life, but would be difficult to live on. The super Jupiter was a red and yellow gas giant with the perfect atmosphere to collect hydrogen for fuel. The gem of the system, and the best candidate for terraforming ever discovered up to that point, was the 3rd planet. The system would be named Centauri, and sold at auction to A Just Colonial, a company made up of mostly expatriates from the superstate of Asiatica on Earth. They would name the 3rd planet Saisei, and bring much of their heritage with them to the project to turn their new world into a perfectly crafted paradise. Finally, in 2380, almost a century after the start of the process, Croshaw II, now named Angeli, and Croshaw III, now named Van, were declared successfully terraformed, with a burgeoning population on both planets very similar to the first colonists who built Port Renatus on Mars. With this accomplishment came the realization something had to change. The process to terraform Croshaw had taken almost twice as long as Mars, and was only successful due to international cooperation. The free-for-all method didn't work for Croshaw, and had already been seen to fail with Hyperion and Phora, and the rampant criminal issues of the Null system. So if the nations of Earth were to continue pushing into the stars, and not fracture back to the dark days of the overpopulation era, then they would have to do it together, as a single species, under a single banner. The World Summit met in early April 2380. The meeting was secret, but the press knew something was happening. Whispers of a big announcement that was to come. On April 23rd, at 6:23 p.m. CSET, the press was led into the General Assembly Chamber of the United Nations, where the World Summit was convened. Delegate Ivan Sang was flanked by representatives of all the major global superpowers as he took the podium. It was there he laid out the plans of the World Summit. Humanity would not be able to continue our exploration of space as they had done so for the past 300 years. National, political, and commercial interests were already starting to clash, and were hindering not only exploration, but threatening Earth itself. So the World Summit had put together a proposal for the future of humanity. A single government for all the nations of Earth, and for the species as a whole. The United Nations of Earth. At this announcement, they unveiled a new flag to represent a united humanity as a single species. This design was printed on a dark blue background and featured 3 interlocking circles representing humanity's 3 main population centers: Earth, Mars, and the Croshaw system, and 6 stars representing the ambition to continue expanding into space. A simple but elegant design to represent the present and hopeful future of humanity. The nations that formed the World Summit, which were most of the large superpowers of the planet, were quick to sign on, and the UNE would establish its capital in New York City in the superstate of Amicanio, the successor to the North American Alliance. The structure of the UNE was very similar to the United Nations, with a Congress instead of an assembly. Unlike the United Nations, the UNE had a single council that acted as the leaders of the executive branch, approving all legislation from the Congress, commanding the military, appointing diplomatic and judicial officers, and taking the lead in policymaking. The way the government functioned was very similar to other large economic and political bloc nations like the EU and the NAA. The individual nations remained in control of their own sovereign states, however would respect UNE law and contribute to the UNE through taxes, and in return would gain representation and a voice in Congress. To ensure that those who participated in the new government were dedicated to the cause, they adopted the citizenship system first recorded in the North American Alliance. Service to the state would grant you UNE citizenship and allow you to participate in the larger government system by running and holding office from your member nation. This was a means to encourage those to embrace the change and likely get citizenship faster, thus having more to say on how this new unified government would develop. While this granted a lot of freedom for even smaller nations, not everyone was on board with giving up even a little of their autonomy, especially the superpower holdouts. However, because this was primarily a means to unify humanity's approach to space, it became harder and harder to resist joining, as none of the remaining superpower holdouts were seeking to form their own counter-unified government, and knowing the last members to join would have the least influence on the future of the UNE. While the UNE was still in its early stage, an incident occurred, which would mark the first trial of this new idea of a unified humanity. On October 20th, 2380, the Amicanio warship, the Stanley, mutinied, demanding the dissolution of the UNE. If the UNE refused, they claimed they would begin bombarding the cities of Earth from orbit. At the time, space warships were an expensive investment only superpowers like Amicanio were able to afford, and even then, not in high numbers. So the loss of the Stanley represented a not-so-insignificant blow to the UNE's spaceborne military fleet. The newly formed council acted swiftly, bringing the combined force of the UNE military to bear on the Stanley. The rebel ship was quickly captured and disarmed, but not before 6 other warships followed the Stanley's lead and rebelled. This small incident quickly spiraled into the first large-scale war in centuries, with the UNE struggling to put down this armed insurrection against its newly formed power. This would become known as the Unification War, and would last less than a year, with the last of the ships destroyed or captured by early 2381. However, on November 8th, 2380, during the height of the Unification War, members of various armed forces that made up the nations of the UNE stationed in New York marched to the Senate building in a sign of solidarity with the new government. The soldiers swore allegiance to the UNE before the Senate, which was almost the same oath given to the modern UEE military. Hear and witness that I do solemnly pledge, mind and body, that I will serve and protect the United Nations of Earth against all who would seek to harm it and its people, that I will faithfully discharge the duties asked of me when called upon. I will defend the United Nations of Earth with my life. I will be the sword and the shield. I will not falter nor fail, but fight and win. And I swear to do all in my power to act as a guardian of freedom and justice, as a champion of honor and valor, and as a true and proud member of the UNE Armed Forces. As a sign of gratitude for their devotion, the Congress awarded a laurel wreath to each soldier who swore their oath before them, beginning a tradition that would last almost 600 years. This occasion would become known as Pax Humana, the second interplanetary holiday of a unified humanity. It still celebrates the service of the members of the armed forces of the unified government of humanity. Unfortunately for the members of the UNE military, their fight was far from over. Later in 2381, Martian separatists declared their independence from the UNE and began fortifying their positions on Mars. Local security forces were not equipped or trained to combat these rebels, so the UNE called out the army to put down the rebellion. This second unification war was longer and bloodier than the first, with the Martians putting up a fierce fight. Yet still, the war would end with the rebellion crushed and the UNE victorious. The last attempt to break the UNE came on July 29, 2384, when a rebel group attempted to attack the capital of New York. UNE forces desperately battled over the skies of New York and were ultimately victorious, ending the third and final Unification War. Those rebels who managed to escape the Unification Wars fled into places like Null and Fora, locations where they could be free of UNE control. Slowly, these rebel groups would turn to criminal enterprises to stay alive, and would become the first interstellar criminal syndicates of humanity, many who still exist today. The Unification Wars were fought to destabilize this new experiment in unified human governance, but its results were the opposite. The shared experiences of soldiers from very different countries fighting side by side for a common goal gave the young UNE a sense of identity. It forged this young nation into one renewed to its commitment to rise together, not as citizens of their home countries, but as citizens of Earth and citizens of the stars. Thank you for watching. I'd like to thank the Patreons on screen now for their continued support. If you'd like to join them for as little as $5 a month, you can help support future videos like this series and get early access to videos from this series as well. I'd also like to thank the editor for this episode, Uri, who without their help, this would not be possible. This is the most ambitious project I have ever attempted to make. I'll be chronicling over 900 years of in-game history, much of it fragmented or incomplete, into a single long narrative line. Its purpose is to give better context to the events and universe of the game in a more linear timeline format, which is easier to follow. Lastly, there will likely be addendums, short changes added to the series as it goes, simply because retcons and additions to the lore are common for a game in development. Thanks again for watching. Remember to like the video to help spread the word, comment down below with questions or comments, and subscribe for future videos. Like I say every time, remember, Ex Historia ad Astra.